welcome
Okay.
to the show, man. I've really been exploring
Yeah, yeah,
Injective
yeah.
ever since we got in touch for you guys to do this recording. And I gotta say, like, some very interesting concepts there. Um, would you like to just quickly explain
Yeah.
Injective to everyone that doesn't know the project already? And then we'll take it from there.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah.
So
So
Injective is a layer one proof of stake public blockchain powering the best possible environment for DeFi developers with the most capital efficient decentralized exchange infrastructure for digital assets and derivatives. The protocol features zero gas fees, instant settlement, and native interoperability with both Ethereum and Cosmos at the moment.
Man, yeah, that's the first thing that stood out to me when I was researching Injective, and I think that's like the part that would intrigue a lot of people the most, and that's the fact of gasless trades. Some say there's not such a thing as a free lunch. So, would you mind to explaining gasless trades and how does this work?
indeed, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Obviously, if a transaction were to be free, it's going to be spent by everyone in an infinite sense. And the way the injective ecosystem enables this gas-free trade is actually creating a very interesting incentive mechanism where there's this kind of a cohort and set of actors called a relayers or an exchange application that can deploy, launch, and service a lot of users from a UI or UX or sometimes even API perspective to allow people to submit trades, to view the latest, on-chain data or market data, and sometimes even support, very unique order types. And these relay or exchange applications can, as a matter of fact, all come together and pay for the user's gas cost and transaction fees in exchange for 40% of the trading fee. So from a user's perspective, they don't have to worry about using a new chain, having to acquire the native token for the chain, and they can just accomplish whatever goal that they're looking for on top of the injective ecosystem and accrue value back to the ecosystem without ever having to notice it.
And that's very interesting because like that's like the main adoption problem of having like interactions with a new chain. Like if you want to go and mint NFTs on Tezos, you might as well get some. Well, you have to get some Tezos in order to do it. If you want to do anything in Cardano, the same thing. Well, in MetaMask, aside from the transaction fees being outrageous, you also have to have ETH on your wallet, which is a bit annoying. So I think that solves a very present problem for crypto people. Um, Another thing that interests me is like you're shifting the model a little bit. You're going for percentage fees rather than, well, yeah, gas. So what motivates this? How did you land up at this decision?
Yeah, I think that that's kind of the standard for decentralized exchanges and centralized exchanges alike. Uniswap charges around 0.3% of the fees for swapping. Binance and so forth, I think charges from 5 up to 20 bips per trade. So I think it's just about the overall ecosystem going with the same norm. Um, it is true that in the traditional equity and exchange market and also for futures market, it does get charged at like a per trade cost. But most of crypto firms are currently going by the notional percentage.
And well, this, yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. It's it must be like a bit annoying having to like compete in a space where you're different enough to be considered, or at least they would put Injective in a different category than what the players that you often see, like in the DEX world. But how would you explain the differences to someone that doesn't know what Injective is?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting component is that DeFi has this really beautiful thing where applications can be built on top of the same infrastructure, liquidity can be shared, different types of assets and derivatives and financial products can be composed and combined together in a certain way into another protocol. And this concept of composability is probably what makes DeFi the most powerful and most promising financial infrastructure for the future because there's literally no barrier and everyone is for the kind of like more outward serving rather than self serving, unlike a lot of like the legacy centralized infrastructures. So in Injective's case, it's really trying to marry the best of both worlds. So generally, due to EVM considerations, um, exchange experience would have to be AMM. It's really expensive in terms of execution, and you only get to swap. You don't get to post orders, and the liquidity is pretty static. People who provide these liquidity often have to face impermanent loss. Even for Uniswap V3, it basically kind of crowds out a lot of people who are trying to even out the game and making it even more centralized towards the wealthy few. And for Injective's case, it's really about bringing that advantage and that experience from a central limit order book, which is definitely the most dynamic and the most flexible means of exchange and displaying liquidity into a decentralized and optimized context while enabling composability and all those magic around decentralized finance to happen. So that's why it's really important for Injective to grow over time and to enable developer adoption, is that it basically expands everything that's possible on DeFi and more.
I mean, there are a couple of ways we can take this, but I think very much, yeah, the order book model is not as taken advantage of in DeFi as it could be. I really think that there's a lot of focus on AMMs right now. Um, and they have like their own set of complications and their own set of benefits. But when it comes to, at least to my own experience researching projects and looking into things, I always like to kind of like, I prefer to see something different than to see a better version of the same thing. Just because I think there are so many things you can explore in crypto and in blockchain in general. I also noticed that this was not going to be like my topic list for today, but I noticed this when I was looking at into your Twitter today again in preparation for this. We had to push this back, this interview, a couple times. Uh, I'm seeing that you guys actually achieved something quite unique. You have the highest token burn ratio in the industry. I mean, that's a feature and that's a difference if there ever was one. What's the story behind all that?
Yeah, I think this really goes back to what the community decided upon Genesis, is that obviously, in order to prevent any type of manipulative tactic done on a lot of these exchanges, um, there has to be some form of fee that exists within a protocol. And it's also kind of like a way to sound true that this is indeed useful liquidity, this is indeed actionable volume, essentially. But
Mm.
where does the fee go to, essentially? There are many discussions around it. People propose different things. And the best way to do it, at least at the current moment, is to just burn it. It's distributing the 40% to the relayer or the application that sourced this volume, and the rest of the 60% will be just going to an auction pool that goes through a on-chain auction every week, and the proceeds will be completely burnt. Obviously, the auction itself converts all those stables or all those quote assets into the native token of the chain, which is INJ.
And what's it like? Because I heard this very interesting take the other day. Like when people are burning tokens, or well, projects are burning tokens, what you're effectively doing is something obviously very positive for holders, which is like you're decreasing the supply, and the demand theoretically should stay the same. So therefore, you have a big chance of your tokens price increasing. But in the end, it can also increase the centralization and reduce the chances of utility, or basically, like, to phrase it in another way, it rather incentivizes the people to hold rather than use. So how do you tackle this problem?
Yeah, I would say that generally price wouldn't be necessarily the important factor or even a factor of consideration when it comes to, I guess, token economic in a sense. when the burn decision was made by the community. I think the more interesting aspect here is that not only there's a deflationary force within the economic, there's actually also an inflationary force that comes from obviously being a blockchain. The block rewards provided by proof of stake and also the stakers. So ideally over time this becomes kind of a balancing force because the block reward natively is actually based on the stake to float ratio. So the amount of token staked versus the amount of token in circulation, and obviously there's a perfect ratio that the overall on-chain mechanism tries to target. And if it ever goes below that, like for example there's too many tokens that are floating, then the inflationary reward will go up. And if there are not enough, there are too many tokens that are being staked, obviously the inflationary reward will go down. And this creates a very interesting balancing force because in the event of every single burn, that means the circulating token are going down, and there are way too many tokens that are being staked as a ratio perspective. So then more from an economic standpoint, more people will probably unstake their token and make it find better rates elsewhere for the native token itself. So these two forces kind of play with each other and balance each other out. And overall, obviously, ideally, it's a very much of a stable mechanism, and it'll drive the overall adoption of the protocol without overly centralizing it, because people can still stake it, people can still aggregate the value.
And well, speaking of adoption, you've repeatedly, I mean, in your materials and in your previous interviews, you've stated your goal is to to enter the top five in volume. Um, it must be hard to do that. I mean, obviously, being in the top of anything is quite hard. But in general, even for example, Binance's servers tend to slow down at peak times, and there are a lot of considerations. So, what do you guys see as like the most important milestones in the way of getting there, in the way of getting to the top five?
Yeah, I would say that currently the most important factor is enabling what's commonly disregarded as impossible within the CeFi world, because at the end of the day, most of the volume is still concentrated around centralized finance. I think for the decentralized finance space, um, it's more of a bigger pie issue rather than trying to take away user base. So it wouldn't be overly competitive amongst the decentralized avenues. But in the context of centralized avenue, Injective has this native advantage that different applications and different types of user level flows and different types of financial protocols can be built on top of it and create natural value aggregation and natural flow of value through the exchange mechanism on top of the injective chain. And with those kind of plethora of applications over time, maybe 100, maybe 200, and who knows, from in the future, there could be 10 application that everybody uses every day. That's how the injective ecosystem as a chain and as a whole grows to be the top, I guess, a top five volume in a sense. It's really about creating a net positive value, then figure out like creative ways to promote different marketing stunts and so forth, or regulatory arbitrage. It's really about enabling a lot more possibility that presents a strong utility for people to move over their liquidity and volume over to a decentralized ecosystem.
I'm trying to think here what would be like the 10 dApps that I would use every day. Um, well, there's definitely room for messaging, right? I don't think messaging is something that has been done correctly or in a good enough way on the blockchain. I don't know. What are you looking forward to having as a dApp? By the way, it's
There's a
definitely dApp,
lot.
it's not the app. Who says the app?
Yeah. Oh, I go with DApp as well. There's certainly a lot of application, and honestly, if you think about it, for DeFi applications, a lot of them at the end of the day still ties back to an AMM protocol on Ethereum, or on Solana ties back to Serum in some form or fashion. And with Injective's order book structure, that means that the auction mechanism, the clearing mechanism, the liquidation mechanism can all go back and rest their value within an order book layer. So you can think of lending protocols, and also um, different financial applications, such as money markets, financialization of NFTs, for example, or different derivative protocols that can be built on top of Injective alongside the native derivative module. And one of the applications that I'm really, really excited about actually is this on-chain market making contract that's Rust-based within the Cosm Wasm layer. And the reason why it's so exciting is that a lot of these proprietary trading firms, like some of the biggest, like Jump, Tower, DRW, they have a lot of technology and IP that no one else has access to, and it's almost like a secret sauce that they use to market make and generate, massive amount of volume, along with the really, really stable and low drawdown return from it, and that's what caused them to be so successful to this day. And in order for some average day folk to access it, they would either have to hypothetically, put their money into a hedge fund, which has its inherent barriers. But more importantly, most of these proprietary trading firms don't even take subscriptions, so most people don't even have access to these type of, I would say, returns. And what's exciting here is that this type of model and this type of market making on top of a central limit order book is being exposed on chain in a permissionless fashion for everyone to have access to. So it's not just providing liquidity into an automated market making protocol, but it's actually depositing into a robust model that's based on Stoichkov and not facing any impermanent loss, and actually being able to provide very efficient liquidity that has very, very low risk compared to a lot of other investments.
Impermanent lost, I would say, like it's the main scarecrow in the system right now, right? Like in the end, it's sort of like keeps these tools away from the everyday user or from like your average Joe, because yeah, you don't want to deal with that. And the minute you confront something that has like the risk of impermanent loss, you are most likely not to get scared at some point and run away, because it's just hard to like compute all that, and most people don't really have the time to, yeah, to actively manage their liquidity pools. So would you say that in the current ecosystem there's a big need to solve this problem and to give people more solutions that go away from impermanent loss, or is it just like something that we're gonna have to get used to as like as a whole?
Yeah, obviously this isn't something that people have to live with per se. It's kind of a symptom or kind of a side effect coming from a automated market making protocol that has this, in all fairness, a very beautiful representation of liquidity in a very, very succinct manner. At the end of the day, it's literally just three variables on a function creating this liquidity pool where people can arbitrage with it, and people can get an instant swap with a reasonable amount of slippage that LPs can get compensated for. So IO is kind of this trade off for a very succinct automated market making protocol that's kind of baked into like a fully decentralized automated market making decentralized exchange protocol. Obviously, there are solutions out there that people have experimented with, but they all kind of rely on a certain level of centralization and certain level of customization. And for Uniswap V3, which is kind of their attempt at resolving impermanent loss, is essentially creating a hybrid between an AMM and also an order book model, where there's a range for the liquidity that people can LP into, but it provides a lot more dynamic liquidity. If being hedged properly and being managed properly, there's no impermanent loss. But I think the most important thing here is that managing this active Uniswap V3 liquidity position is actually very gas intensive, and it's completely not worth it
Hmm.
if you're just a person with less than maybe $1 million. So at the end of the day, it's really really about creating this liquidity protocol or this market making strategy that's accessible to everyone, that really decentralizes market making for both the largest institution in the world and individuals.
When you say decentralized, a couple of times just there, and I'm just gonna take this whole thing to like a another extreme, but like, oh, we can always come back. I got thinking about like the famous Uniswap delistings, the famous, yeah, this whole case where like they faced regulatory pressure, for anyone that doesn't know about, and they had to delist some assets that were synthetics, that were classified as risky, and well, you guys are spearheading, or like one of your big mottos is truly decentralized. So how do you feel about this case, and do you think you can survive the same kind of pressure if it comes to it?
Yeah, I think that's generally fine because for Uniswap's delisting case, it's just taking it off of their front end. Um, and people, if they want to allow for access, it's still permissionless on a protocol level. And that's really what's important because even for the injective chain itself, there's multiple exchange applications that have this local jurisdiction, that have restrictions on what they can service or type of people they can service. But what really matters is that the protocol can't be censoring people. The chain can't be blocking people from accessing things. While the application layer, it's understandable. Like, let's say if I want to enable a fiat gateway or an on ramp or some type of advanced feature, there's always going to be financial regulations done on the local level for people to adhere to. And I think there's nothing people can do about that on the application layer. But to be a protocol, to be fully decentralized means that there has to be a way for them to access. There has to be, ways for them to communicate within this peer-to-peer protocol, because otherwise that's not a blockchain anymore.
I mean, can you elaborate on that last point? Why is it not a blockchain anymore?
Because it censors people.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
um, I mean, and I would get like I would get Uniswap's point. Like, of course, if your project is led by a CEO that has a public presence, if you have a company, if you have, I don't know if they have offices, but if you have offices, I mean, if everything is incorporated, it just makes sense that you would have to at some point meet the real world at a halfway through, right? Which doesn't mean like Uniswap's primitives and what the Uniswap uses as a base layer cannot be used to trade these exact same assets that people are blacklisting just through a different UI. And to me, that's what makes sense, and what a lot of the discussion around surrounding this thing didn't really focus on. Although you can see by how quickly it escalated uh, downscale, you can really see how in the end it wasn't that big of a deal in people's minds. I think, like, as well, like you said, solving it at a more base layer problem, I mean, at a most base layer level, it's better. And when it comes to your own scalability, what other things do you think about, or what other things do you think should be there at the most basic layer in order to continue growing and providing that security, that scalability, everything in that line?
Yeah, there's actually quite a few very interesting primitive that Injective enable and sometimes inherits from Cosmos SDK as well. And in terms of scalability, first of all, since it's a application focused or application specific blockchain with this native exchange and derivatives module, it does things 10x, if not 1000x faster from a processing level than like a VM based blockchain. And the reason for that is quite simple: is that it's being done very native to the consensus layer rather than through a smart contract and going through a lot of kind of redundant processes in a sense. And that's kind of what Cosmos is really focusing on, is that these blockchains have a very optimized application that's kind of built to be focused on this subset of application. Um, but obviously, if there were to be, a million users, 2 million, or 100 million users, it's still going to eventually face like a bottleneck at a certain point, and that's when another primitive of Cosmos really stands out, which is IBC, and one their upcoming model, which is a share security model, because basically it allows to for Injective to have a child chain or sub chain that can be an isolated independent consensus. Maybe it's not necessarily an independent consensus because it's shared by the same set of validator, but it can have its own block production and so forth, and yet very natively and seamlessly synced with the chain itself in terms of user experience and also some of the important state information. So you can understand it as, let's say, there's more than 100,000 market on Injective, and the main chain might not be able to handle all that load in the world. What could happen is that there could be a child chain, still supported and secured by the same set of validator that's basically, managing a subset of market, let's say 1,000, 10,000, or 50,000, and those markets will go through, will have its own order book, its own data availability. Applications can still access it, communicate with the main chain through IBC. And the most important information, which is the final balance or the positions, will still be fed back to the Injective chain. But from a user perspective, it doesn't feel like anything has really changed. And I think that's really what's amazing about IBC, is that every single project building using Cosmos is trying to really hard to abstract away this bridging process amongst those projects that enable IBC. And another really interesting aspect is that using the same type of property, there's also work around enabling, Ethereum virtual machine on top of Injective, along with, a permissionless cosmosm layer that kind of expands the possibility for more and more smart contracts to be built on top of Injective. Because currently, given that it's so application focused, that the Cosmos layer still requires a certain level of governance gating to be able to deploy contracts. But once there's a child chain that can have a more relaxed block time, that can process more things, is deployed essentially, then it means that a lot more things are possible from an application layer and from a developer standpoint.
Right. I mean, that's what people like about Cosmos, right? The flexibility.
Yeah, I would say it's not just a flexibility, because technically you can build anything on top of most of those VMs. It wouldn't be Turing complete if it's not.
Right.
In kind of like a broad sense, but building it in a practical manner, in a scalable manner, in a cost-efficient manner, that really requires a consensus level tuning and customization around it, which is what Cosmos SDK is focused around. And Injective kind of inherits that property along with an Ethereum native experience where users can use their MetaMask, don't have to switch wallet, can just sign for like transactions and trades. So basically, the flexibility is immense when using this stack.
I don't like to bring out like competitors right away, or like possible, yeah, you know how in like this field, when we talk about competition, is quite a broad word, right? Because ideally everyone wants to think as of themselves as building something on top of existing things and having a positive feedback loop amongst everyone rather than competition. But it's of course very obvious that sometimes there are comparisons around all around. And one big one that I've seen a lot while researching more about Injective Labs is Thorchain. So, would you like to address, because I think it's very interesting that people draw this comparison, because there's some point where it overlaps and some where it absolutely doesn't.
Yeah, I would say Thorchain, and obviously Thorchain is actually a partner with Injective Labs. We're working on actually a few ways to work together, which is actually pretty interesting now that you brought it up. But I think Thorchain is fundamentally really addressing a different problem than what the injective community is trying to address. Thorchain excels at connecting to many chains, bridging over their asset, and create this kind of like a cross-chain AMM liquidity hub. And the way it works is that, hypothetically speaking, I have Bitcoin and I want to swap it over to Ethereum. Um, Thorchain would be kind of the premier destination for it for a quick swap. And what Injective really excels at is, first of all, it has a derivative layer. It enables this futures, perpetual, and later on option. And really, that's in the injective ecosystem. Bread and butter is adding a lot of the advanced financial tools, comparing to a typical AMM exchange. Another really key aspect is that Injective is order book based, and so that means that it creates a lot more advanced tooling, a lot more advanced financialization. For power users who have who's trying to swap 10 million worth of Atom to USDT, or trying to hedge their 10 million position in Atom, Injective would be the premier destination to do it, essentially, because it allows them to get better slippage. It allows them to kind of TWAP the execution, or access to derivatives and futures to hedge their position.
Hmm. Okay, and well, you dropped the you dropped the news, or I don't know if this has been publicly announced, but like, which other ways are you like seeing of collaborating together?
Yeah, obviously, I would say the first thing is bridging. It's
Right.
actually like a pretty long partnership. I think we initially had a lot of conversation around a year ago around the bridging discussion, and there's been a lot of work around, especially on the Thorchain side, for enabling IBC to access the greater Cosmos ecosystem as well. And that's still an active work to this day to make it happen.
I think I mean there are names that are under recognized or under hyped in the blockchain scene, and Torsion is like one step above all of them because they're doing something that everyone claimed was super necessary for the industry, and once they fully solved it, no one cared, which I figured it's a pretty unique case. Um, because I remember a lot of conversations about like these kind of swaps or about these kind of models back in the day, and nowadays no one seems to care. Well, why would you think that is?
I would say it partially has to do with the proliferation of bridging protocols that kind of offset a lot of the value prop that Thorchain brought forward back in the day. And I still think that Thorchain is a much more native experience for bridging things over, because again, you get to swap the asset instead of bridging over a tokenized representation of the asset. And another pretty
Exactly.
key thing is that Thorchain as its own chain might have a little bit of trouble to be integrated with a lot of different, DeFi protocols on a destination or a source chain. And it's definitely, like a lot of work and a lot of coordinated effort amongst community members to make it happen. And this is why, composability is absolutely important and critical, because um, generally, a DeFi protocol can't really send messages or arbitrary instructions across chains into a destination chain. And those have tried. Quite a few of them actually got hacked as a result, and so it's first of all, a very important value capture and value flow, because integration within a DeFi layer is going to be the most important growth factor.
Also, when you mention hacks, there's like and I must at some point stop using this as a talking point, but in general, it's something that I'm very interested on. Um, Like the crypto industry has these Jesus-like figures where everything they say turns into like the conversation point until they go and say something more interesting. And Vitalik put out this article about bridges, and he's been like hammering on it, which has stressed a lot of people in the cross-chain community quite badly, because nowadays everything surrounding bridges is under scrutiny.
Yeah.
What do you think about this? Aside from like the obvious answer, well, yeah, bridges are hackable. We need to work on making them more secure. But yeah, how do you feel about this whole cross-chain debate?
I would say this is really more of a process. Basically, like a lot of people, and definitely the space as a whole, is still pretty new to managing, operating, and designing and developing different types of bridges. Some of them could be a little bit more on the centralized end, which is POA, and some of them could be on the more decentralized end, which is kind of what Injective is doing with Ethereum layer, and also the overall like most of the IBC protocols out there. And at the end of the day, it's so Vitalik mainly brought on kind of like the economic and security assumptions behind bridges. I think what's important for the space is to make sure that the bridging layer over time is ironclad in terms of security, and this is the only way to kind of make it like a fundamental assumption for the general crypto users in order to kind of usher into this multi-chain world. Um, yeah, I think that would be the most important part. Is it's a there's no easy answer to it. No one's going to come up with a magic bullet that solves overnight on the whole like bridge security issue. It's really about an iterative process, just like contract security back in the day, to come up with the best practice, best solution, and people slowly strengthening the assumption around bridges.
Man, yeah, and it's such a necessary thing, because it would really be a shame to have like this multi-chain world not interconnected. I mean, I'm a big supporter, as I said before, of like people doing different things. Why? Which is why I tend to frown upon like when people are trying to build like the next ETH killer or the next high throughput chain. Uh, what you really want is see people doing things in a different way, and of course, the more different it is, the more you need to find ways to interconnect that kind of thing. Whereas without bridges, that just like silos value in a lot of different places, and probably limits how we can grow as an industry, and less than as an industry, I would say, as a movement. When it comes to all of that, how do you, yeah, what strategies do you see in place for your own growth? And I'm making this question vague in purpose, because I just like to, yeah, to give you the floor to think about like how, yeah, how to attract more users and more value, liquidity, etc.
Yeah, I mean, like for Injective's lab side, we operate a relayer called Injective Pro, which is basically just kind of like at this point a reference implementation for a lot of other exchange applications, because we contribute to the core blockchain. So we're probably the fastest to come up with some sort of like application layer presentation to the user, and from that point on, other projects building on top of Injective can take it from there and develop their own kind of twist to it or their specific application to it. And for the Injective Pro growth side, it's really I would say standard at the moment. It's about growing the user base from partnering with different uh, influencers and celebrities, and creating this referral system, and yeah, like more about making sure that people find it, and making sure more and more people gain access to it and get exposed to it. The more interesting part would be how does the protocol or the ecosystem grow as a whole, and I think there's actually really um, good methodology to think about it, is that it shouldn't be about a coordinated effort where some guy at the top just points at a certain direction and everyone would have to move along with it in the community. I think it's about setting up the incentive breadcrumbs, setting up the incentive design and also the economic considerations, and having people to aggregate their mind share and their effort around it. So, for example, right now, like on top of the injective chain, there's kind of, I think, 10 active relayers and applications, all finding their own moat, finding their own value within the space. And really, it's because of that 40% fee split. They have the incentive that if they can grab the user, they'll find a very robust decentralized exchange infrastructure that they don't have to worry about building, and yet they get to capture 40% of value from the protocol. So that's a really strong kind of native incentive that, hey, if I create a good enough experience, if I create a nice way to onboard users, then like I capture a lot more value for a lot lower R&D costs, basically. And as a matter of fact, there's a lot more unique and interesting twist to it as well. I think there's a project called Frontrunner that's trying to build a sports betting platform on top of Injective, utilizing the order book infrastructure, where like they'll have access to a completely new market segment that most of the community members didn't even think of, and utilize this infrastructure that actually, in hindsight, was perfect for. And yeah, it's really about like setting up the ecosystem, setting up the incentives, and attracting really smart community members to build on top of it, to grow into their own kind of like a either a business or a protocol or a project. Yeah, and there's obviously a lot of incentives that can be devised when more and more developers come on to build native financial protocols, or like projects on top of the injective ecosystem, and not necessarily just on the application layer.
I really like that example, because I can see from my not too deep understanding of Injective how that kind of project, like what you said about sports betting, that would fit very well on the model of Injective. What else? What other projects are you noticing or are popping in the radar of the ecosystem that you think are well fitted to do something that they couldn't have done outside of Injective?
Yeah, I would say another really great example is Picasso Exchange. So they're more focused on bringing in the general user, really optimizing the user experience around some of the most intuitive, or one of the most native kind of exchange need. So they turned this order book infrastructure around and turned it back into a swap interface, except with far superior slippage and cost. And on top of that, like they've been one of the most power developers around exploring new mechanisms and exploring new features. A good example is that, technically speaking, stop loss isn't really possible on chain because your order gets exposed, and thereby as an on chain primitive, it might be manipulated. But that doesn't mean that you can't leverage other aspects of the chain or other features. And relayers um, can currently, like a lot of relayers are also working on this, is that they can utilize, off Z, which is kind of an approval equivalent on top of Injective. Use a grant off Z message to execute a certain transaction type, and trust a relayer to execute this message, and also, most importantly, maintaining the privacy of this order until the trigger condition. So really, it's about like exploring the protocol, finding really interesting and actually creative ways to enable really cool features, and yeah, like convince the users to bring on due to these really strong features.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite cool. I never thought about like not being able to have like stop losses purely on chain. That in and out of itself is a great use case. And it's little innovations like that in the end of the day, right? um I remember like when I first learned about Thorchain, like it seemed like they were hyping up something like really and I'm just going back to like the example that was already in my mind. This is not meant to be like a conversation around Thorchain, uh, but like it really seems to be like an underwhelming use case. But then you think about everything that you can do with it, and yeah, it makes sense. And the same goes for Injective. Like, you don't notice how far the order book model goes until you think about a bunch of ramifications. Man, as we start nearing the hour and the time to wrap up this podcast, I'm just curious if there was anything that you wanted to discuss on here, or that you like to, or that your community is particularly excited or talking about right now that you'd like to address on this conversation.
Yeah, I think like obviously I personally am not really like a marketer per se, and but what's really interesting is that with this incentive for applications, a lot of them are like coming up with like really cool like community activities. Like for example, Dojo Exchange, which is also like Relayer, an exchange application on top of Injective. It isn't necessarily like coming up with like really cool innovations or like really interesting ways of utilizing the core protocol, but rather they're just going around and creating really interesting community activities, making it engaging and fun for them to use the exchange, creating competitions and so forth. And I think overall, it's not just about the technology itself; it's also about how people can make it an engaging and exciting experience for people. And so yeah, like we'd love to have more people to check out all these like applications that are spending a lot of time and working really hard to make it happen on top of the Injective ecosystem. And on top of that, I would say currently there's been a couple of things in the work in terms of community spend pool structuring, where people can request funding from the protocol through the DAO structure, and also ecosystem fund that's going to come out for general investments. And there's been a lot of strong backers behind that as well, and just would love a lot of people to get aware of.
Cool. Yeah, definitely go check that out, guys. And beware of anyone that tells you they're not a good marketer because they probably are.
Well, I mean, it's not my job per se. Yeah.
Well, you're doing a good job holding up here, um, man. In general, I would say that we covered most of the aspects I wanted to cover. I don't have a good segue into this, so I'm just gonna jump right into it. Front running. Your your platform, let's call it that, runs a lot on like trying to solve front running, and in my mind, until I started looking deeper into this, not too long ago, that was a bit of a whale problem. Like, I was very surprised to find out that that's a problem that affects little users like me. So, would you like to just help people clear out that misconception that front running is only a problem for whales?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because that's kind of like I would say like a nascent feature of Injective that actually kind of inspired the birth of Injective back in 2018, because back then I was doing a lot of cryptography research at the university lab, and one of them was coming up with a crypto primitive called a verifiable delay function, and Injective actually born out of utilizing this to create this decentralized concept of time to resolve front running and collision issues. So yeah, really great that you brought it up, because that's kind of how it all started. And now Injective obviously is rid of any type of front running issue because of the matching process that utilizes a frequent batch auction. So the reason why front running is a lot bigger issue than what you would typically find within the traditional equity market, or the stock market, is that on Ethereum it's a dark forest, in a sense, where everyone can see exactly what you're doing, and any type of your order and any type of your trade is immediately viewable by everyone. And that's really great for transparency, but that also becomes an issue when um, people that can find ways to exploit this, they can find ways to create a quick arbitrage to take advantage of. So that's why even for in the traditional market, front running only happens for very big people, because there's value extract, the risk is worth it. Whereas in the Ethereum, or more within the EVM context, front running is so easy to perform and accomplish that basically for anyone making like a meaningful trade size, they can always make that couple bips of spread or profit. And a lot of people, like their required return is very much different. There could be people with $1,000 or $2,000 worth of capital trying to earn like a couple dollars per day just by doing this, whereas there could be really really big guys trying to earn at least 10 bips on a certain large size trade. So it's both like a beauty of decentralization and transparency, because everyone gets to participate in this type of like minor extractable value in a sense, or like front running, but it's also it's also hurting the user a lot.
And I mean, I think your solution is different enough to like warrant a different category rather than other solutions that are being pushed to avoid front running, sandwich attacks, MEV, whatever you may call it. Uh, because often these solutions are more in like the privacy, zero knowledge space. Uh, how would you draw that distinction?
Yeah, I would say that generally there are a couple of solutions. I think right now, um, obviously I could be completely wrong here because I'm not like a full on I don't really do I'm not too up to date with the MVV and like the gas auction stuff, but I think right now the most practical method is just to contact a miner and he'll shield your transaction until the very last second and just not gossip it. um, I would say, for like the current, solutions through ZK Rollup and through, I guess, some sort of privacy preserving transaction types, it's definitely very, very promising from an EVM context. But that being said, do have to consider the fact that from a research or from a theoretical paper into a full-on production-ready application, they're still lacking of many steps. And for example, like Starkworker and Starknet are very, very impressive piece of technology that has, been in a development, even just ZK Stark itself, 10 or 20 years almost. And Starkware and Starknet to this day still can't be, like fully decentralized as a result, is because the computation to generate the Stark proof would only be possible at the moment. Obviously, it won't be the case pretty soon through, like a centralized node or an operator, essentially. So, like all those theoretical solutions, it's sure as hell a lot easier to build an application specific chain that rids of this problem completely.
Right. I'm gonna say like I came to blockchain from like a marketing perspective, so I haven't yet conquered Starks, but like I'm going for you. I'm going to understand you one of these days. Um, Aside from the super deep technical concepts, is there anything that we didn't cover in this episode that you'd like to quickly go over?
No, I think that's pretty much it. Like feel free to check out the overall ecosystem. I think injective.com is a pretty nice place to start, and feel free to follow Twitter and everything.
In your Twitter account, it's definitely a lot of fun, man. Like I like the memes basically. Isn't it injectivelabs.org? No,
It's
sorry.
injectivelabs.org is kind of like the team, and injective.com is kind of like this landing page for the overall ecosystem, kind of like Solana.com or something like that.
Right, that's why injectives.org that's why injectivelabs.org seemed like a bit empty. Okay.
Yeah,
Good. So yep, I think we can wrap it up then. Make sure to check out more about Injective. I mean, in general, like these podcasts are a good place to start, but you want to check out all the materials yourself. Everything that they've put out, it's aside from very thorough, very nice looking. So I'm sure people are gonna have a fun time doing that, just as I had a fun time talking to Eric here, man. Thank you very much.
great. Yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
And well, thank you to everyone that's still watching. Please go check out like Injective, follow the podcast, subscribe, and all that. We'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.